I thought I should probably start by just explaining myself, really, and explaining how I came to write this rather unusual book. It began when I got sent to Mexico with The Economist in 2010, and I thought that I was going to be writing about sort of fairly ordinary subjects, regular business, whether it was the oil industry or the car business or tequila or tourism, this kind of stuff. But this was 2010, and just as I arrived, the drug war arrived, and this was a time when in Mexico the murder rate was really spiraling. It almost doubled in the space of just 2 years. And so quite quickly I found that this was really the subject that people wanted to talk about. You'd go to interviews or parties or business roundtables or whatever, and quickly you found that the subject very often returned to this subject of the drugs business. And so I started writing a lot more about it than I had expected. And I got into this habit of doing, business stories one week and drug stories the next week. And the more I did this, the more I did the two, the more I came to see that actually the two weren't quite as different as you might think. And I began to wonder if actually the drug story was, in fact, a big business and economics story that we'd been missing. So I started to try and think about it in those terms. And I'll give you an example of this. Soon after I got there in 2010, there was this extraordinary case where the Mexican government discovered a gigantic cache of marijuana near Tijuana. It was the biggest seizure in Mexico's history. It was more than 100 tons of the stuff that they found in a warehouse on the edge of the city. And so they got all this stuff, they got all the marijuana, they unpacked it, and they made a gigantic bonfire out of the stuff, doused it with gasoline and set the thing alight. And it was an incredible sight that the police were there having to make sure that no one was standing downwind of this big fire, because it was like a 100-ton joint. And anyway, it was smouldering away, and I was marveling at this and wondering quite what this meant for organised crime. And it was widely reported at the time that this represented a blow against organised crime to the tune of about $500 million. That was how much this particular seizure was valued at. And I gave this some thought, and it seemed to me, implausibly high, because there aren't many companies in the world that can withstand a shock of $500 million. And the cartels, they're big, but they're not that big. So I started looking into it a bit more and tried to look at how this estimate had come about. And it was fairly straightforward. It sounds very kind of sensible. All they'd done, they'd figured out the rough retail price of marijuana in the States, because that's where these drugs were heading. And they'd conservatively estimated that it's worth maybe $5 a gram in the United States. And then they'd multiplied that out over 100 tons and arrived at this figure of $500 million. And it sounds plausible at first, but if you give it a moment's thought and apply it to any other ordinary business, you can see immediately how insane this is. Imagine if you tried to do this with another product like coffee, for instance, and you said, okay, well, the retail price of a cup of coffee in the United States in Starbucks is, $3, $4, something like that. And in that cup, you get perhaps 2 grams of coffee, so maybe coffee costs a couple of dollars per gram. So that means that a kilo of coffee seized in Mexico must be worth $2,000. Obviously not the case, right? Or imagine trying to calculate the price of a cow using the price of a steak in Washington, D.C. You'd get a very weird figure. And this is exactly what we're doing. And so I did a sort of rough calculation of what I thought this marijuana seizure should really be worth using wholesale prices in Mexico, which, needless to say, are much, much lower. The wholesale price of marijuana in Mexico is maybe about 8 cents per gram. So those 100 tons are probably worth somewhere a bit less than $10 million rather than the $500 million that we were told. And so this kind of shocked me. It made me think, well, if in fact what we're doing on the supply side of the business is sometimes about 98% less effective than we believe, then what else are we getting wrong? And this was when I started to really think seriously about looking at this business as a business rather than as a sort of a war. And in so doing, I identified that the cartels more closely resemble businesses than you might think in various ways. And